Well, today I want to talk about a statement that Jesus made that has been widely misunderstood. The instruction to turn the other cheek. Now, I had this idea to talk about this because actually it's a sort of roundabout what happened here. Monday, by the way, is Tish B'Av, which is the 9th of Av on the Hebrew calendar. It's when the Babylonians and later the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and it has become a major fast day of the Jews. It's mentioned in Zechariah. On it, they read the book of Lamentations, and I do recommend that you would read that Lamentations probably over the weekend and for timeliness, along with our online UCG commentary. Very helpful material there to go through. But anyway, I was looking through Lamentations, and I came across a reference there to turning the cheek, giving the cheek to an enemy, and it's actually mentioned there. And I thought, oh, that's actually something I've wanted to talk on, something many in the ministry covered in a ministerial Zoom class and on the Gospels. And I recently addressed this in some committee work as part of a larger subject. So I want to delve into that. Now, I'll note the Lamentations reference a little bit later, but I want to start in Matthew 5, if y'all turn over to Matthew 5. In Matthew 5. Some interpret Jesus to mean that we are never to resist or fight back against an attacker, whether of ourselves or of our spouse or our children. As a father and a husband, I can say, that seems unimaginable. That you would just let something horrible just happen and not do anything. It might sound like we're supposed to just let others harm us and our loved ones over and over, inviting them to keep harming us. This turn the other cheek also. But that's not what Jesus was talking about. So, brethren, I will ask the question, what was Jesus talking about? And the title is simply, Turning the Other Cheek. What did Jesus mean? Turning the other cheek, what did Jesus mean? So I want to start here in Matthew 5, looking at verses 38 through 39. And we see that he says, you have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So that has to do with the retaliation. That's the lex talionis, the law of retaliation in that sense. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. So that's the directive. And it's actually said in this context of this legal principle, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In seeking justice, to not resist an evil person, it says, but if slapped on the right cheek, to turn the other to him also. That's what it's telling us to do. But I want to have you hold your place here because we're going to look at a couple of other places. Hold your place right here, and let's look over to John 18. John 18. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples of people that were hit on the face and what their response was. First of all, in John 18, verse 22 through 23, this is what was happening to Jesus. It says, and when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, which is interesting because in this case he didn't say, well, he turned the other cheek. Because it says, Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? So that was his response when he was struck. And here's another one. If you turn over to Acts 23. Acts 23, this was, so he challenged that, what was done, is the point I want to make. But Acts 23, in verses 2 through 3, this is about Paul. Acts 23, in verses 2 through 3, it says, and the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And then they said, well, you were reviling the high priest. And he says, well, I didn't know he was the high priest, because I wouldn't curse in that sense. But his response to what was happening was not to just, roll with it in that sense. Now, it should be noted that the verses here do not explicitly say that they didn't turn the cheek, as such turning of the cheek could have happened and not been recorded, but the recorded verbal responses to these strikings, Jesus calling for justification and Paul issuing a curse for injustice, don't seem to fit with this idea of just turning the other cheek as often understood, that we're to be completely yielding to mistreatment. That's not what was happening here. So I want to go back to Matthew chapter 5, Matthew 5. I want to note that Christ's directive in this regard was given by him amid a number of statements involving circumstances dealing with the legal court system. If you skim down through here, you can see that in Matthew 5, verses 21 through 22, talking about murder, being in danger of the judgment. It says if you say raka, you're in danger of the council. That's the Sanhedrin. Again, this for a damaging insult or slander. You're going to be in trouble with the law, in other words. And then if you continue in verse 25, it says, agree with your adversary on the way. This is your adversary in a legal court system. It says, lest they deliver you to the judge, and the judge hands you to the officer, and the officer puts you in prison, and I should say you won't get out of there to the last penny. So this is again a legal issue. And then of course he talks about taking oaths, and then we come to verses 38 through 39, an eye for an eye, as it mentions, and then it says, don't resist an evil person, turn the other cheek. Okay, it's followed by verse 40. If anyone sues you, give me your cloak or your tunic also. We've often understood this to mean if there's an actual case against you, to have it totally settled, not just to give in to frivolous lawsuits all the time. That would not be showing care for your family or those you're providing for if you just, just give away all your money to anybody who sues. I mean, this means you to settle cases that need to be settled. You're going to deal with it quickly. Again, we're talking about dealings with the legal court system, although this may all concern dealing with civil authorities more broadly. We see in verse 41, it says, if anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. That was what would happen with the Roman legionaries. They could compel you to go, but you're to serve very helpfully because you're going to do what you can for the sake of peace and goodwill with the authorities. That's what we're being told there. But it is not saying to be a total doormat and always just accept ill treatment. That's not the point. None of this is about how to respond in the moment of a brutal attack. Neither is this matter in verse 39 of not resisting an evil person and turning the other cheek. Notice that the reference is specifically about being struck on the right cheek. So if you think about your own right cheek, it's somebody hitting you on the right cheek. Now, people would typically strike with the right hand, which would go to the, if you can imagine my hand coming at you, that would come to the left side of your face. You wouldn't slap somebody with the left hand, as even in the Middle East today, that's unacceptable because the left hand was considered filthy, given that they didn't have toilet paper then. So you just didn't do that. That would have been seen as quite vile. But a cheek slap in the context of that day was an insult, as shown from reference to early Jewish literature. It was meant to offend honor rather than inflict physical harm. So this was an issue of struggling, not an issue of struggling in a physical fight against an attacker. And a slap to the right cheek would actually have been done with the back of the hand. So if I'm using my hand to strike you, I would have to on your right cheek, I would have to come backhanded like this. And what's interesting is that Jewish sources state that a slap with the back of the hand would be fined double that of a normal slap. This is quoted in John Gill's commentary. He's quoting these Jewish sources. He says, he that strikes his neighbor, which Maimonides, a Jewish sage, explains, he that strikes his neighbor with his hand shut, a fist, about the neck, he shall give him a selah or a shekel. A certain amount he'll be fined. Rabbi Judah says, in the name of Rabbi Yosei the Galilean, 1 pound he's fined. If he smite him, as Maimonides says, if he smite him with his double fist on his face, like he's actually kind of fighting him like this, or as Bartanora with the palm of his hand, so it's an open slap, on the cheek, which is a greater reproach, this is in the Talmud, a greater reproach is a slap on the face, He shall give him 200 zuzim, and if he does it with the back of his hand, 400 zuzim. So the back of the hand is a bigger fine. Now this is because a front-handed slap would be done out of anger or punitive action, but a backhanded slap, I want you to think about this, like this, showed utter contempt. Like brushing away that also avoided touching the person. It's communicating in disgust, away with you, and out of my sight. It was extremely demeaning and insulting. Jesus was probably on one level, speaking of foregoing the legal right in a court setting of seeking retribution for public insult, such as suing for damages. But his statement is probably not limited to that, being more broadly about willingness to suffer further humiliation from detractors rather than seek retaliation. This would not mean never answering back appropriately or never standing up to defend our honor or that of someone close to us, but we are not to be seeking revenge. That was the first point that introduced this, was about, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth in that sense. Jesus' directive to not resist an evil person in the same verse should be understood the same way. Clearly, this cannot mean we must never resist an evil person in any sense, or we would need to stand idly by when a false minister tries to lead the church into apostasy. We're also commanded to resist the devil. In the context of Jesus' statement, we are not to be demanding an eye for an eye and trying to get even for every offense. Rather, in turning the other cheek, we are to take the personal insult and allow for more, rejecting the way of retaliation and vengeance. None of this has anything to do with dealing with an immediate physical attack so that we would not attempt to stop an assailant, but would rather offer no resistance at all and keep turning the other cheek with every hit to the face. That is just not what it means. If this was about a brutal attack, why would Jesus be telling us to just keep inviting further blows, almost egging on the attacker? Why is there no mission of just leaving or trying to get out of there or getting your wife and kids out of harm's way? Again, this is a serious misunderstanding. Jesus was not addressing that situation. Now, I mentioned Lamentations. Let's quickly turn over there. Lamentations 3. And this is in right after Jeremiah there, Lamentations 3, verses 27 through 30. This is what God told those who were, going into captivity basically at that time as a punishment on the nation. Lamentations 3, verses 27. It says, I'm in 37. I knew I was in the wrong place. Okay. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth, like you're having to undergo this while you're still young and able. Let him sit alone and keep silence, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust, there may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him, and be full of reproach. Okay, so this is talking about the Jews going into captivity for their national sins, and they need to accept God's judgment on them to bear the reproach or insult, the shame. Being struck on the cheek here is being full of reproach and accepting that. This could even be where Jesus' wording came from, though maybe that had become legal terminology more generally. Okay, I want to bring this to a close, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you what you should do in the midst of some assault. I just want to show you what Jesus was not saying. He was not saying to always roll over, just let yourself or your loved ones get pummeled and pummeled. Neither was this or his other statements in Matthew 5 meant to say that you should just always take any bad thing done to you or your loved ones and never stand up to it. I want to end with a perhaps surprising example of a Christian leader who was not going to tolerate others insulting his wife, who was ready to take some physical defensive action as his responsibility from God. And it's someone most of you know. This is from the autobiography of Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, Volume 1, Chapter 28, under the sections, The Plots Progress and Defending My Wife. He talks here about two of the early church board members, Oberg and Ray, who acted friendly but were secretly trying to get him kicked out of the ministry. The conference president informing him that those guys were going to say Mr. Armstrong's wife was not a neat housekeeper to show that he was not meeting the biblical requirements of an elder in ruling his household well. Mr. Armstrong writes this: "There have been times since I have been changed by God's Spirit that righteous indignation aroused instantly to white-hot heat. This was one of them. But I prayed, and God helped me to put down anger. Also, it came to mind what to do. You may not think God put it there, but I do." He said, "I told the board members and other brethren assembled that I understood this meeting had been called as an inquisition to crucify me by false charges. I told them I did not wish to defend myself. I told them I knew I was full of faults and weaknesses, the same as each of them. I stood there and confessed many specific faults and weaknesses and asked them if they would pray for me that I might have help in overcoming them. Their eyes began to fill with tears, all but Oberg and Ray. Then I quickly ended by saying that Mr. Oberg and Mr. Ray might say anything they wished against me, but that I understood they planned to accuse my wife falsely. And I told them, with all the power I had, that God made me my wife's defender, and that if either of them dared to utter one word against my wife, I would, if need be, close their mouths before they could finish that first sentence. I did not specify the means. This was said with blazing eyes and a sharp voice. I sat down. Mr. Helms then called on Oberg and Ray. I don't remember what they said, if anything. I do know there was nothing left for them to say against me, for I had said it all myself before them, and they somehow must have known that I meant it when I said I would defend my wife's honor. They were silent about her. I do know the result. Their plot backfired. So Mr. Armstrong says he meant it when he told those men he would close their mouths for them if they started to badmouth his wife. And he also says, you may not think God put it there in my mind, but I do. You know, being kind and being loving does not mean doing nothing to defend against physical and verbal assaults, especially against, attacks against our loved ones. Some things demand a response. I think of Jesus making a whip from cords to drive the money changers out of the temple. I imagine if one of those guys had dared to strike him, that would have been the wrong time for that. I don't think he would have stopped what he was doing. The final takeaway, brethren, let's put Jesus' instructions into context and not stretch them beyond what was intended. That's a good lesson for all biblical interpretation.